Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at the Sony a6400. I'm not going to waste your time with flashy introductions or anything stupid like that, so let's just get right into it, yeah? So the first thing we're going to discuss is about the camera body itself. Obviously, in terms of size and weight, this is a Sony APS-C camera. If you take the lens off, you can actually fit it in your pocket. Super lightweight. Doesn't really weigh you down carrying it around, not like a big, Canon DSLR or something like that. And then on that subject, this thing, it feels pretty heavy duty. The body is made out of, I think, magnesium alloy, which is a pretty strong but decently lightweight material, and I mean, it feels like it. I've dropped this thing a couple of times because I'm extremely clumsy, and everything's still functioning. Flash pops up, every button still spins and that sort of thing, so no problems there. And speaking of that, it does also have some basic weather sealing. The body itself is sealed against, it's dust and moisture resistant. I've taken it out in a few light drizzles, some light snow, that sort of thing. It's never had any problems with that. I don't know if I'd take it out in extreme conditions, but there you go. But yeah, this camera definitely feels like it's built to last. This thing, I don't know, probably get 15 years out of it before it starts having any problems. Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly just going off my previous a6000 that I had. I've had that thing for, God, a long time, and I've never had any problems with it. So I imagine, Sony's newer lineup should be pretty much the same. And then next subject we're going to touch on is the ergonomics and the comfort, I guess, of using it. So with this model, they did actually make the grip a little bit bigger compared to previous a6000 series cameras. So yeah, it's not quite like using an A7. It's a little tight still, but I find it's decently comfortable. It's comfortable enough to where I'm pretty happy with it, especially given that it doesn't add much size to the camera. So I am happy with that. And of course, when you're using a camera this tiny, it does depend a lot on which lens you have. This is the Sigma 16mm. It's not huge, but it is decently long and pretty heavy, so it does make the camera kind of lean. It's a little front heavy. That being said, I've used tiny lenses like the Mikey 35mm on this, and it is quite literally a pocket camera if you choose the right lens, which is pretty awesome. And then beyond that, the actual day-to-day usability, the button layout is pretty good. I mean, it's standard. You have your shutter button in the front, you have a custom button on the top, the mode dial, another dial on the top, the flash pops up, though honestly you should never use the built-in flash. And then you've got everything you expect on the back, including this nice lever thing that is customizable. So I set my top gun to focus mode and my bottom setting, I guess you could say, to drive modes. So yeah, that's pretty good. And then on the side of the camera here, we do have a headphone jack, a micro USB port, and I believe that's a micro HDMI, if I'm not mistaken. So pretty good amount of features packed into a tiny camera. No complaints from me there. And then speaking of button layout, this camera, like every other Sony camera, also has a lot of customizable buttons. On the top of the camera, the custom run button, of course, is customizable. On the back of the camera, I do believe the up and down lever selection is customizable, and then everything on the back dial, along with I think a couple of other buttons too, but it provides, I would say, a good enough amount of customizability for hobbyists. Maybe if you're a professional shooting weddings or something, it's not going to be enough for you, but honestly, if you're shooting weddings, you're most likely using a little bit more of an expensive, nice camera with more features. So, and then as for autofocus, we've come to expect good AF on Sony cameras, and honestly, this is no exception. There's not anything super unique about it. I mean, it just autofocuses fast in photo and video. You don't really have issues with hunting. Obviously, that is a little bit lens dependent too. And then features like IAF are fabulous, and AFC, subject tracking when people are moving. I haven't had any problems with that. It's usually super reliable, though it can slip up in some very high speed situations, like if you're, trying to photograph a vehicle moving through the frame. Sometimes it can trip out, but that's to be expected. And then beyond that, the burst mode of this camera, I believe, can shoot 10 frames per second in RAW. I don't know what the before is, probably like 30 images or so. And then besides that, if you're a manual focus user, you probably know that Sony cameras have a good amount of features relating to that. Peaking, focus magnifier, that sort of thing. This camera has those, and they're completely functional. They're great. Okay, and then next up, if you know anything about Sony cameras, typically the EVFs are a little bit weaker than competition, and I don't know, the EVF on this thing, I've never been too concerned with that. The EVF, to me at least, it looks good. It's decently high resolution. I don't think there's blackout in dark conditions, so I have no complaints when it comes to the EVF. And then for the screen, it is actually a screen that flips up, which is awesome. So if you are shooting a video like I am right now, you can use it to see yourself. Unfortunately, I am shooting with the a7 III, which does not have a flippy screen, but it is what it is. And speaking of the screen, it does have a touchscreen feature built in. It's not super useful, like you can't navigate the menus with it, but you can tap to focus, which I've actually found is decently convenient, especially when shooting in, crowded situations, like if I'm trying to photograph something in like a big city with a lot of crowds. Having that touchscreen just makes it a little bit quicker and easier, so good stuff there. So as far as battery life goes, unfortunately this still uses like the classic APS-C Sony battery, like the tiny one here, as opposed to the new battery style that like the a6400, the a7 III, that sort of camera might use. So battery life is decent, but it's not great. I believe it's weighted to about 350 shots if you're using the EVF, and then a little bit more than that if you're using just the screen. And I think it can shoot video for about 120 minutes, so about 2 hours until it dies, if I'm not mistaken. So it's good enough, but if you buy this camera, you definitely want to pick up a set of extra batteries. Speaking of that, a lot of people are not sure if they should get the genuine Sony batteries or if they should just go with a cheap off-brand. I'm going to be honest, I could get a bigger affiliate commission if I told you, buy the Sony batteries, but you don't need to. You can just get the off-brand third-party batteries, and they're almost as good as the Sony batteries, but they're like half the price. I've always just bought off-brand batteries. I've never bought a Sony battery, and I've been fine. So, and now let's talk about image quality, because that's the most important part of a camera. So this uses the same sensor and everything that pretty much every other APS-C Sony camera uses, and it 24 megapixel images, a lot of detail, dynamic range is typically pretty good. I definitely noticed it's a little bit better on my a7 III, just being a more expensive and higher end camera. But the dynamic range on this, I've shot a lot of sunsets. I probably put them up on the screen here somewhere, and I've had pretty good luck with that, especially if you do some exposure bracketing. Typically the dynamic range is never going to be an issue for you. And then speaking of that, ISO, like high ISO and noise performance, it's pretty decent. I'm mostly comparing it to my a7 III, and obviously it's not quite as good as that. But compared to my my a6000 that I used to use, oh my god, this thing's a lot better than that. Typically you can shoot at sunset and have clean handheld images. Not really much of an issue with that. So, I put more images up on the screen here that I've shot, at sunset or at night in darker conditions, and you can kind of judge that for yourself. And then finally, the last thing that relates to image quality, I guess, is this camera does have silent shooting mode. So, normally you have the shutter sound, but you can turn that off, and I haven't had any issues with that. It makes it silent, which is great if you're shooting indoors for think like if you're photographing a church or a library, I guess. Anything where you need to be quiet. The silent shooting setting, fabulous. And now that we've covered image quality, let's talk about video quality. So this camera, it can shoot 4K 30 FPS, I believe 1080, 120, I think. It might be only 60 FPS, but in any case, pretty typical video specs for the price range. You do get SDAG too, I believe, but with that being said, you know, those sound fantastic. But the biggest issue with video with this camera is the fact that you don't get in-body image stabilization, which it's just kind of sad that they didn't put that in. Honestly, like with the flippy screen, the 4K resolution, this would be a pretty good camera for video, but just the lack of IBIS, man, come on Sony. I just, that makes me a little bit disappointed. But if you primarily shoot video on a tripod or you have a collection of stabilized lenses, obviously that's not going to be an issue for you, but I definitely got to knock them down a peg for that. Kind of unhappy with that. But with that being said, they do have a microphone jack on this camera, which is nice. So video performance, besides the lack of stabilization, is fantastic. Okay, so finally, let's wrap it up. Who exactly is this camera for? Honestly, I would say anybody who's looking to do photography. Not video necessarily. You know, like I said, it can shoot video, but the lack of IBIS sucks. But if you're a beginning photographer, and I would say this kind of is a spot in the market that the a6000 used to have. The a6000, if you know, is discontinued, and typically you're only going to find it for like $600, $700 now. So I think for beginners who might have considered that camera, might just want to consider this. It's a little bit more expensive, but you get way more features, and you can actually find it in stock on Amazon and B&H. But yeah, it's a good beginner camera. Like, it's a Sony APS-C camera. It's fantastic. And then for like enthusiasts and hobbyists, someone who's a little bit more experienced, I think you'd still like this camera, honestly. There's really no negative aspects when it comes to taking pictures. I mean, dynamic range, fantastic. Image quality, fantastic. ISO and low light performance is pretty damn good, especially given the cost. So yeah, the only people I would not suggest this camera to, you know, are professionals. Someone who is photographing weddings, senior pictures, anything that they're actually getting paid for. You're probably going to want to get something a little nicer, you know, A7 III. Even if you're looking to stick with APS-C, consider the a6400. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much it for me. Hopefully you learned some things from this. As usual, if you would prefer to read a much more detailed explanation of everything, you can find the link in the description on the on the site. And then beyond that, you know, if this helped you, like the video, consider subscribing, you know, the typical YouTube stuff that everybody tells you to do. And yeah, thanks for watching.